I'm back here again, and I chose this spot not just because it's aesthetically nice, but also because these relate to story elements in my life. I've already said how much I was always into ghosts, and the way that they're depicted like that, and for Halloween, is something that goes back to the Irish celebration. And then this right here, it's my cousin's, but it's a Scottish flag, and that's basically our main background is Scottish and Irish. It's Celtic. So even though we're not directly in touch with that, that's a big influence on who we are. And and then growing up in Salmon, Idaho, Sacagawea and Lewis and Clark were really famous there. So I was surrounded by imagery of Native American and early Western American things, and I didn't meet Native American people very much, which is sad because um, there was a lively interaction in my dad's family and his grandparents' generation, and there's a lot of Native Americans in Idaho. So again, to me, they were a mysterious and fascinating people that I never really got to meet, but that I wanted to, and I could see all around me that they were part of the world I was now living in, that they were supposed to be part of it. And then one of the most important places I ever spent a lot of time, my grandparents' house. They were actually my adopted grandparents, but they've always been real grandparents to me. Um, that is, I spent more time with them than any of my biological grandparents, so that's how I think of them. When I think of my grandparents, I mainly think of them. Um, and and anyway, he was very proud of having done mission work in South Africa, Lesotho specifically, and he had all these decorations around his house. This rug that was hung by the back door, and just a lot of trinkets and things that whenever you walked into his house, you had to think of Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. Like you couldn't not because it was just all around. So, hearing his stories and his fascination with Africa, then that, you know, naturally cultivated that in me. Um, China, there was this book that I loved as a kid, which was this little old man is walking into a great city, and the people of the city don't know, but there's barbarians on their borders, about to invade them. And the little man, it's a Chinese story. I think it's actually a traditional Chinese story, but I'm not sure. But the little old man, he's poor, he's nobody, and he greets the people at the entrance to the city, and he asks, someone for, someone to welcome him, and they don't take him seriously, and he continues to journey through the city while these barbarian hordes are on the way, and nobody welcomes him. They just see him as this poor, insignificant old man, and he goes all the way to the royal palace, and the royal family like laughs at him because he would actually have the nerve to go ask them for a welcome. Well, and the part I forgot is that he always offers. He says, if you invite me to a meal, I'll give you the greatest treasure I have, and everyone just laughs at him like, you great treasure. And then they start hearing that that these hordes are on the way, and they want to, well, now they're concerned about that. Well, he finally he's just about given up, and he finds this one poor little boy, an orphan probably, who he asks to invite him to a meal, and he's like, oh yeah, and the little boy invites him to share the little meal that will hardly even feed himself, and the old man is just thrilled, and then he gives the gift, his greatest treasure, that he promised to the boy, even though that's not what motivated the boy, and he shows his true nature, which is that he's a dragon, and it's this ginormous Chinese dragon, and I say ginormous, it's like all over the horizon, and these barbarian hordes are terrified by the dragon, and they ride away on the horses that they rode in on. I spent more time on that story, but that's, to me, that was my impression of the Far East, was was that story. And I love that, and it's very biblical, like the whole feel of that story is a lot of ancient stories are like that from around the world. That kind of wisdom, that kind of teaching humility and hospitality, and also that there's this hidden, terrifying but beautiful divine just beneath the surface in plain sight everywhere. All those things. I just love that. And then India. I remember I remember as a kid seeing a colorful depiction in the shape of a wheel that was like, I don't know, I didn't understand it. I didn't know what it meant, but it was this wheel-shaped picture of the cosmos from a Hindu or a Buddhist point of view. And it's interesting that, the kind of narrow-mindedness of the church I grew up in, and yet my parents were always really curious people, and they didn't they were not really careful about exposing me to things that could, you know, lead me to alternative ways of seeing and thinking. They liked listening to music and watching movies from all over the world, and especially my dad, and so I just looked at that and was fascinated by it, and I was fascinated by other religions, and I was fascinated by language, and I remember, trying to help my dad when he was working on the car, and I never understood that, but I was fascinated by the label on the side of his toolbox because it was in like 8 different languages, and I would just stare at that and try to put it together somehow and realize some of them were more alike than others, and I just loved that, and I became really interested in poems, and writing poems when I was like 6, and I've always written poems since then, and this obviously majorly morphed in how I did it, but all these things are related for me, and I really got into language. Like I tried making my own phonetic system. I didn't know I was doing that, but I noticed that the letters of the alphabet didn't make sense, and I wanted them to make more sense. And then I just kind of accepted them as they were, but had this appreciation for how odd some of the peculiarities of the alphabet were. Um, and so that's more like cultural and religious and linguistic, and then there's the scientific. So, I love science. My dad always loved science. He'd watch science fiction with me, and they actually work a lot of real science into science fiction, and and so not just reading science info cards and books. And I was homeschooled. I never mentioned that, but that's kind of a big part of all this. And um, and then also, just watching things that explored different. So a lot of science fiction TV series will actually explore things that scientists wonder about, and so that actually helped train me to it won't really train you to think scientifically, but to build a scientific curiosity and to learn about a lot of the things that are live topics in science. But thinking scientifically is something that I think I do fairly well. I mean, at least I've been told I do, but I need to be logical. I need to be. I've always been this way where I want things to make sense. I want them to fit together, and so I'm kind of jumping around now, but it's okay. I was supposed to read the Bible every day, and I did not do that consistently, but I did read through the Bible like 3 times as a kid, and I've never read through the whole thing even once as an adult. So um, most of my putting it together um, is from then. And then I've went back to points of interest as an adult, trying to make more sense of it. But my dad would tell me, read it and ask questions, write down your questions. And I didn't know what questions to write down, but what I didn't realize I was doing was I was trying to synthesize what I learned, and I was noticing what seems to be abnormalities and exceptions, stuff that didn't make sense. And those would later drive having a more real understanding of what I had read and how it related to the rest of the world, like all these other cultures I was being exposed to. And then there was, and then there was, you know, evolution, the big bad theory of evolution, which, again, my parent, I love dinosaurs. My parents let me look at stuff about dinosaurs, and they just said, oh, by the way, when it mentions that it took millions of years for all these things to happen, that's silly nonsense. Just disregard that. So I tried, but that was fascinating and it was mysterious, and so it was very attractive. And so I always found the theory of evolution to be really fascinating, but I accepted that it was not true. And it was around when I was like 9, 10, that I remember being exposed to evidences. So it was scientific evidences that the Bible is true, and that creation of the universe happened like 6,000 years ago, not millions of years ago, and scientific evidence that this is true. This is true, and it's very important that um, that you follow that. And then evidences of the resurrection of Jesus being true. And it's funny, I haven't talked about Jesus much yet, but Jesus is what is the one consistent part of of all of this going on into the future. Practically everything else changes except, well, that changes too. But what it is, it's the point, it's the star toward it, which everything goes, which is what is love really. And and when you're exposed to real love, and when you start to see real love, then it has to rearrange everything else, because you can't you can't stay with an anemic version of love and keep everything else as it is. You have to let true love rearrange the rest of your cosmos. And so that's where that's all going. But at that time, it's just, okay, I'm just learning the way things are supposed to be. And I was fascinated by those things, and I wanted to understand them. And so I would read all this little book series called Does God Exist? And it was all about how life and the universe are too complex to be by accident, and that proves God created it. And after 2 or 3 or 5 of those, I was like, okay, I get that. But it was negative. It was like, it seemed more focused on proving the bad guys false than what I wanted to focus on, which was just that, oh, this is really amazing. This beetle and this flower and this thing about planets and this thing about the universe. I just love those things, and I didn't like the vibe that it was all about proving false what the other people were saying. I was like, okay, I get that. Yeah, there's no way this is all an accident, but I'm not gonna like hammer that every single time I learn something amazing about the universe. I'm just gonna be like, wow, the universe is amazing, and go from there. So I guess the next chapter will go from there, starting I've almost gotten to being a teenager. Scary.